Yeah, fine.
And I guess we can start. Professor, how civilizations fall, in your opinion?
Well, you know, I'm very influenced by, of course, by the philosophy of history of Oswald Spengler, Arnold Toynbee, also of Hegel or Giambattista Vico, and the fact that civilizations are not eternal beings, but exactly like human or biological bodies are conditioned by birth, growth, adulthood, decline, old age, and death, or rise and fall, as many people say. That is, of course, something that we know since classical antiquity. So I'm quite persuaded also that this is a natural phenomenon. Somehow we have to accept, exactly as we have also to accept our own mortality. That is one point. And as we are, of course, focusing also our interview on Tolkien, this is also an insight which is omnipresent in Tolkien's words. If you look at not just the Lord of the Rings, but especially, of course, the stories from the Silmarillion, we see that the entire history of Middle-earth is, of course, nothing else than a succession of the rise and fall of important civilizations, be it the elves in Valinor, be it the different elf kingdoms in Beleriand, be it then, of course, Numenor as the archetype of the rise and fall of a civilization, and then, of course, Gondor and many others. So there is also a very strong component of rise and fall of civilizations in Tolkien everywhere. So I think he certainly also belongs, let's say, to that more traditional approach to the mortality of societies and civilizations.
Mm-hmm. In Tolkien, we can clearly see in Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion as well that in Tolkien view, probably, the civilizations start falling or are in decline when they distance themselves from nature, from some sort of natural state of being, and we can see that clearly by Isengard, where this is just evil industrial complex. So further from nature, the closer to the fall. If we can simplify like that, do you think that is justified? Do you think that Tolkien thought in these terms, in this way, and is it true? If we can, I am wondering if we can put that into perspective on modern civilization.
Well, yes, but I think that the disregard for nature, which is indeed present in all these societies and civilizations starting to fall down and to decline, is just a symptom, I think, for something larger, because it's, even though nature is, of course, extremely important in Tolkien, but it is not important as such. It is rather a symptom. And what I think, for Tolkien at least, is more primordial than the disregard for nature is the disregard for divine law. And of course, the respect for nature is part also of the divine law, but it goes further. If you look, for example, the downfall of the elves starts, of course, with the hybris and arrogance of Fëanor in Valinor. The fall of the elves also in Beleriand also starts with Thingol, for example, and his disregard for the gods, with also the king of Gondolin, who refuses to evacuate his city. Later on, with the Númenóreans, who disregard the divine law to approach Valinor. by ship, and of course also by the realm of Gondor, whose king start to be disinterested finally in their own offspring, and are much more proud of their own ancestry. So you could say that this disregard for a certain divine order and a certain form of arrogance and of hubris of the created being, which does not want to be limited to the constraints imposed by the gods, but wants to be much more than it, starting already with Melkor and with Morgoth, who doesn't respect the limits set also by Ilúvatar, that this is the initial sin. And of course, this is accompanied then by also disregard for nature, for the environment, for other beings, and so forth, but rather as a symptom. And indeed, if we look at also let's say historical civilizations, of course, we see that in the end phase of each and every civilization, also we have a certain lack of respect for traditional religion, for, let's say, the historical solidarity societies also that have been created through nature, an interest only in short-term individual egoistic interests and not the interest of the community, of the family, not just from one generation, but also for the future. And of course, this is exactly also as in Tolkien's secondary creation, accompanied by a disregard for nature. And so even the Western phenomenon of environmental pollution, for example, and the let's say artificial extinction of certain categories of beings and of animals and so forth, is from that respect nothing really new, as we see, for example, in also in classical antiquity, which is my specialty, of course, as an ancient historian, a very similar phenomenon where in the last decades the sources have much and more been studied through the lens of environmental pollution and of the disregard for nature. And so today we know, of course, that in late Republican and Imperial Rome, there were also absolutely horrible conditions when it came to the respect of nature, and that even the entirety of Italy had been deforested, that there has been a massive ingerence of humans in the natural equilibrium of nature, which in the end led, of course, also to agricultural catastrophes, and that kind of thing. So to conclude, I think that Tolkien indeed has a point in putting forth this combination of disregard for nature, but also disregard of divine laws in his secondary creation, and that corresponds quite well to what civilizational studies today would also put forth as indeed as symptoms of these stages of historical evolution.
Okay, maybe it will be a bit naive perspective, but we can agree probably that we have better life conditions than our grandparents and family before them. So of course we can also agree that there is we are straying away from traditional values and religion. But the quality of life in Western Hemisphere, at least, is significantly better than 100 years ago, or especially 200, 300 years ago. So how can we say that Western civilization is in some sort of decline? I assume that that's your point, but I didn't ask. Is it? I just said that because I heard your speeches and texts. so yeah, that's
of course. Yeah, sure. Of course, we need to define these terms. Are we really better off than our grandparents? Of course, we need also to see where did they live, under which conditions. It's sure that the situation also in Eastern Europe is different than that in Western Europe. There are different regions which evolved in very different ways and so forth. So it's always difficult to simplify, but nevertheless, yes, we might be, or my generation at least, I'm 42 by now, might be better off than my grandparents. But already I am not better off than my parents. That is already very, very clear that my generation is very clearly, even from a material point of view, in decline in comparison to the generation of my parents. When I see, for example, in my own family and of that generations, what kind of style of life my parents' generation was able to finance with one salary, holidays, buying a house, that kind of thing. And if I see what my generation, and even more so the generation, of course, that is below me now, how they have to struggle and how difficult it has become with just one salary to nourish an entire family, then obviously the peak of material well-being is over. That is quite sure, even from a quantitative point of view, at least in Western Europe. It might be a bit different, of course, in the former communist countries where there is a slightly different curve, but at least in the Western European countries, the peak has been is already over, and we are now for the first time since many years in a generation where the young people very clearly say that they expect to have a worse future than their own parents. And also the parents' generation which knows that their children will have much less amenities in life than they had. Things like a nice pension, holidays, buying a house, nourishing a family on just one salary, that kind of thing is over by now, unfortunately. So materially, it is clearly going down, even in comparison to the previous generation. But I think that's not the most important anyway, because it's clear that one can be, let's say, better off materially than others and still live under enormous sufferance as spiritual beings. And if we look at the enormous problems our civilization is experiencing for the moment, where everything that is related to, let's say, spiritual well-being and traditional values, like the place of the family in one's own identity and one's own environment, if we look also at the enormous decrease in friendship quality and quantity, there are many studies on that, how the notion of friendship is declining massively. If we see also that spirituality, as I said, is declining, when we see that the importance of being part of a certain civilization and culture and wanting to defend it and to define oneself through it is also important for the human being, then we see that all these values are disappearing, have even disappeared, and are leaving the Western being more and more as a disoriented individual that doesn't have any anchors anywhere, be it in family, in religion, in tradition, in the nation, in culture, in language, whatever. The human being just as a sole individual without orientation, feeling more and more scared, and just believing basically that existence is about consuming things, having some form of hedonist lifestyle, doing its career, but without any form of ulterior being. And so I think that someone, it might sound even fundamentalist, but I think that someone who really believes in values and believes in the fact that there is something more important than himself, and if he's able to fight for these values, perhaps even to sacrifice himself, but at least to do something for these values and to invest his life in them, then I think that he is probably much more happier than someone who leads the existence of a bee or of an ant, just as part of an enormous collective beehive, where everyone struggles a little bit for himself, but without any form of ulterior spiritual aim. So that is, I think, also part of this what can be called the decline of the West, and that is, of course, also something we see massively in Tolkien. If you read the description of the last generations of Numenor, this corresponds exactly also to the spiritual problems of the modern Western man. So I think that Tolkien also had, of course, this insight, this diagnosis, and he perceived that all this is not going to end very well for us, as it didn't for the island of Numenor.
This question just popped out just now. Because I was wondering about this some time ago. There are some, it's hard to say, charts or schemes of civilizations that are rising and then declining. And I was wondering, because it's a quite, we can say that it's a pattern, not maybe the same in all civilizations historically, but there is some pattern. Do you think that, for example, Western civilization, as it is in decline in opinions of many, can somehow, like it's a stupid comparison, but like a stock action, like a stock market, because when it goes down, and is there a possibility that it can bounce up and still thrive in the future? Do you think that's possible? No,
I don't think so. Of course, we have to beware not to be naive and just have a vision of civilizations rising and falling. So that it's much more complex than that. And I've tried in many articles and in the book I'm writing for the moment to delineate also evolutionary stages of civilizations, which are much more precise and which try to show that even though there is this general movement, all these different stages also have their sense. It is exactly as a human being. Of course, biologically, there is a phase of growth, and then we reach some form of peak, a biological peak somewhere in the 20s, then perhaps also a peak somewhere perhaps in the 40s when we have our total, let's say, intellectual maturity and still bodily capacities, and then slowly it goes down, obviously, until death. But that doesn't mean that everything, let's say, below 40 is not very good, and everything afterwards is also just a catastrophe. Every age has, of course, also its own importance, and many people can have a dreadful childhood or young age and can be very happy and fulfilled old people, and the other way also. So I think that all these ages have their different their justification, their importance, and even though we are in a phase of decline as a civilization, exactly as a human being, there are still things to do. It has still some worth, and even if we are nearly at the end, still we have a certain maturity, we have a certain knowledge, we still have certain capacities that should be utterly exploited in order to make sense. And even from our decline, there still can be in the future be other civilizations or other societies who can have a certain profit of that. For example, as we are talking about Tolkien, even in there are two things that I find important in that respect in Tolkien. On the one hand, Tolkien insists very strongly on the fact that even and especially from let's say from danger, from sufferance, from misfortune, still these are subjects that can be worthy of a song, that can be transformed into something beautiful, and even if it is bought with many sufferances, it can still create something that is as such a rich testimony of art and of beauty, even though it represents a certain suffering. So that is one possibility that is still obviously there, even in a declining civilization, and even for people like people like me, I could say, or like us, being the last conservatives who are somehow also suffering from all these elements, but who are trying to transform and transcend their suffering into something that is better. On the other hand, also the second aspect that strikes me from a Tolkienian perspective is that very often it is in these last moments of suffering, of decline, also of moral corruption, that some people at least have the possibility to, again, to transcend this sufferance and to sow the seeds for the future. Like if you look at the first age, where it is just from the ruins of Gondolin that Earendil is brought forth, and that he, in the midst of the total disaster and decline and the shipwreck that is Beleriand, still is able to bring the Silmaril to Valinor. Or at the end of the second age, or middle of the second age, when Numenor is falling down, this gives, of course, the possibility also to Elendil to escape from Numenor and to bring the holy trees to Middle Earth, and to build a foundation of something that then later could become Numenor, could become Gondor. So I think this is this double responsibility, an aesthetic and spiritual, and also a very concrete responsibility that is still also incumbent on the final stages of a civilization, which is why I wouldn't just adopt a model where the end of a civilization is only associated with decadence, despair, and senselessness.
Mm-hmm. In Tolkien's trilogy, and not only, there is very often throughout all the books, basically, we can sense that Tolkien is deeply he thinks that the human being is weak, it's just weak creature, let's say. Do you think maybe how to make humans stronger? Because at least from some logical conclusion, there are times in a development of civilizations that there are strong people that build this civilization, and build their community, family community, and then broader country and other structures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's as all questions in Tolkien. This starts as anecdotal and fantastic reflections, and ends in theology and dogma and religious dogma, of course. And this is also one of these questions where Tolkien can only be understood from a Christian dogmatic theological point of view in order to really guess what he wanted to say. And yes, exactly as you said, the human being, and not only the human being, by the way, the elves and the dwarves and the hobbits obviously are not also much better. All these are just creations by God, obviously. So they are flawed somehow. The elves are flawed, at least since the hybris of Feanor. The human beings also with their treason of the gods, at least at the different battles against Morgoth, and probably even before. So all nations or all races in Tolkien have their moment of sin. Finally, they are all flawed. They are all sinners somehow. And that is something, as you said, that needs to be overcome. But paradoxically, for Tolkien, and in opposition to Hollywood, the greatness of the human being, of the elf or whatever, doesn't lie in wanting to overcome these flaws by becoming stronger and more intelligent and fighting all the monsters and killing them and become the king of the world and then fighting Morgoth and killing him. That is what the Hollywood perspective would be like. But rather the contrary. It is first by realizing one's flaws and by limiting oneself and not necessarily trusting even oneself. And that lies the ultimate greatness of the human being. The Hollywood theology would be Boromir. Boromir is the one who wants to take the ring in order to fight evil and to win and to create by the force of weapons happiness and order for everyone. That would be Hollywood. And Tolkien shows very clearly, no, that is the path towards danger, towards treason, and finally towards death and disaster. The true hero is the one who doesn't accept the ring, like Aragorn, or even like Gandalf, who say, no, I can't accept this. I can't have faith in myself because I know I would be overpowered simply by that wealth. So we need to refuse this power. We need to destroy it. We need to sacrifice ourselves because we can't have confidence in ourselves. And I think that shows a very different image of humankind somehow, where the true strength emerges from the inside into one's weakness and also into this ultimate belief that we cannot create and guarantee our happiness by ourselves as human creature. We can try, of course, we can strive for it, but ultimately everything comes from above. We have to try, of course, it's our duty, but we shouldn't believe that it's just up to us. So if we are faced with a choice where on the one hand we do the morally right choice, but we know that leads to disaster, and on the other hand we have a morally wrong choice, but that could lead perhaps to political success, then Tolkien would say, you take the first way, you take the morally correct way, because only at the end of this, only if you disregard your own interest, you could say, and if you stay on the right way, then perhaps the guarantee comes from above. And that is exactly what the story also about Frodo means, and the fact that this enormous trilogy is the contrary to a story with a happy end, which is something that many viewers don't really understand, or they try to transfer everything on Sam as the real hero, which is not at all the message by Tolkien. Tolkien's message is that even Frodo, who sacrifices his entire existence finally for destroying these rings, and who goes to the brink of absolute mental and physical breakdown, who is really a Christic figure somehow, because of all this burden he shoulders for the entirety of Middle-earth, even he, in the end, is tempted and fails. He fails. He wants to use the ring in the last seconds, and so he is saved finally, not by his courage, but he's saved by his pity he had for many weeks or months, even for Gollum. And it is finally and involuntarily, thanks to Gollum, who attacks him, of course, that he is saved himself from mental and moral corruption, and that his task is completed. That is this typically Tolkienian oikatastrophe, where in the end the hero doesn't really manage to fulfill his job because he's just a human being or whatever, and fails. But because of his effort, because of his wish to stay morally clean, in the end, things turn out thanks to the divine compassion.
In Lord of the Rings, we have clearly a stage of decline of civilization. And it's very clear that there is no doubt who is good, who is bad. The world is basically bipolar. And do you think that as probably Western civilization is heading to decline, it will be more like that? It will be clear what is good, what is bad, and the world just will be black and white. From what I noticed from politics in recent years, the tendency, not in Poland, in Europe, in the United States, is probably it reminds of just the world that is there are clear boundaries, what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad.
Yeah, well, of course, for Tolkien, there is a clear division in what is good and what is bad. So there is let's say, a good principle, God, the angels, and so forth. There's, of course, the bad principle with Melkor, Morgoth, Sauron, and so forth. So that is quite clear. It is not, let's say, a morally ambiguous world like in Martin's Game of Thrones. That is sure. But the different protagonists of Tolkien are not as clear cut. I know that very often Tolkien is reproached of having designed a world where everything is black or white, but I can't see that. It's perhaps a little bit the case in the movies. That might be the case, but I see rather in his different novels and myth and so forth that most of these heroes are people who are doubting. Fëanor is very ambiguous. Túrin is a tragical hero who sins. The Númenóreans, they are not really bad or good somehow. Isildur also, he succumbs to the ring. Boromir is fighting with himself. Even Denethor just has the best of his people in mind. Frodo anyway, Sam is tempted. Gollum is also such a gray figure in between. So I rather see that all these creatures are struggling somehow to define themselves. But of course,
major scale,
so,
forces of good. In a bigger scale, there are forces of good, although
yeah. That is the forces exist. The forces are indeed even though we have to see that even Sauron, even Morgoth have their sides, and some of the gods like Ulmo, for example, or others also have their somewhat ambiguous sides. But yeah, Tolkien supposes the existence of a good principle that is supreme and of a bad principle that is, of course, inferior, but that is still there and very influential. And indeed, we see that today more and more the political fight in the West is not anymore a fight of different shades of the center, like before, where you could say, well, it's not good against evil. It's a little bit of socialism against a bit of Christian democratics and a bit of libertarians and that kind of thing. So it was, for a long time at least, not a fight between two principles. But indeed, by now, these principles are becoming more and more clear-cut in politics also, as we see that an entire side of the political establishment is now embracing politics, which corresponds more or less to 100% to everything all religious books have averted us against. So you could somehow see that most of the modern leftist political programs corresponds one-to-one to everything the Bible has ever said you should avoid, and the Quran also, and the Torah anyway, and Confucianism and whatever. So it becomes more and more a metaphysical battle, and as we see that so many people now are dissolving the notion of family, of sexual identity, of solidarity to the next of kin, of solidarity also to your people and your society, and are putting forth rather these ideals of transhumanism, of considering the human being just like a machine, of dissolving even the notion of human self, and of speaking about the necessity of downloading your brain somehow into computers, and all this scientific or scientist utopia that is indeed a dystopia. Then, of course, fighting against that becomes more and more a fight against the really metaphysical evil. And so indeed, yeah, the political fight is becoming more and more obvious, a dualistic moment where you are either on the one side or on the other. And what was in between is now shrinking more and more, and you are either there or you are there. And these two sides are, in my opinion, more and more identified also with principles of metaphysical good and of evil.
Okay, so I think we can end here. That was the last question. Or if you would like to add something, which we maybe but yeah,
not necessarily. No, I mean, there's so many things to say yet.
Yeah,
but,
it's always something more to say. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Of course, yeah, I think that the question about nature and ecologism and if nature is more a conservative or leftist thing, we didn't speak about that. But from my point of view, that's not necessary. And I think our time is running out, or we have to launch a second Zoom meeting. Then I'm not sure. It's up to you. It's as you wish. I'm fine like that, but of course I can also respond to other questions as you wish.
So maybe shortly, because we have 2 minutes, about this question about nature, because of course we think about more liberal leftist forces in politics, which are claiming at least that they are protecting nature more, and conservative side is often accused of not respecting nature as it should.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we shouldn't forget, of course, that the ecological movement is something that emerged rather from the right side of this political spectrum, the late 19th, early 20th century. So indeed, the roots of ecologism are rather with conservatism and traditionalism than with socialism, who discovers ecologism quite lately. And even now, this fusion between ecologism and a more leftist political orientation is something that stems basically from the 60s, I would say, or from the 50s. Not a specialist of that, of course. And indeed, the fact of wanting to conserve nature and to consider the nature as it is there as something that needs to be conserved, as an equilibrium, as a harmony that needs to be conserved as it is a deeply conservative thought. It's not a progressive thought. It is a deeply conservative thought somehow, and so it is a bit of a pity that conservatives have lost a little bit this interest for nature. Nevertheless, even today, there is a big difference between ecologism on the left and on the right side. For conservatives, nature is something that is animated, that is created by God. For the left, nature is just matter somehow that evolves from evolution and so forth. Of course, there's some pantheist speculations here and there, but in the end, the view of nature as being a spiritual part of a spiritual realm is rather present on the right side, exactly as this idea that man has been created in order to care for nature. So man is part of nature, but is also superior to nature, needs to conserve it and to care for it. Whereas for the left